Welcome back to the History of the Papacy Podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and lead the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Hey, welcome back, everybody. I am with Greg Gassman again of the Popeular History Podcast. In the last episode you heard, we talked about a setup of Pope Francis's papacy. We talked about the early Pope Francis, the Cardinal Bergoglio, and all of his storied career up to the point right before he was elected. And now we're going to transfer into the actual papacy of Pope Francis. Now, as of this recording in early May of 2025, sadly, the Pope has reposed or passed on. When we recorded the first episode, he had not died yet. So we're recording about 3 weeks later for the second episode. So I would definitely highly suggest listening to that first episode. Now we'll listen to the second episode and then just basically open the floodgates for Pope casting from this point forward, as we move through the funeral, which I know Greg has covered. And maybe we can talk a little bit about his thoughts and from the actual funeral, and then we'll move on into future episodes into the Conclave and then the early papacy of whoever the next Pope X will be. And so, Greg, how are you?
I am doing well. I'm tired. That's for sure. Because I'm not. I am a general papal history nerd, but I am more specifically like a church admin and cardinals nerd, like the handing over process and this transition period, this sede vacante is utterly fascinating to me. And I knew I would be running around like a chicken with my head cut off whenever this came along. It is sad to see Pope Francis go. Granted, I'm a bit, I guess you could call me a bit of an easy to please Catholic in the sense that I have, genuinely been fond of each Pope of my lifetime. I think that's probably true of a lot of Catholics. There's just sort of something beyond like the day to day, back and forth of the hustle and bustle. I'm like, yeah, you see, especially if you look at some of the inside Catholic baseball, different people, favoring, one approach or another. But at the end of the day, the Pope is the Pope when there's sort of a soft spot there, even beyond like the general, theoretical deference. But it's like, it's grandpa sort of situation.
I think that's a great way to look at it, the grandpa situation, because if you think about it, he's 4, 5, 6 steps removed from you in your parish. And if you get stuck into all the inside baseball, it kind of, I don't know the right way to phrase it, but I think it could really tax even your faith, honestly, if you're looking at him almost in the way we look at a president or in other countries, their prime minister. Like, I think you have to separate it. He's the very big picture, and
sometimes literally up in the parish hall.
Yeah. Your day-to-day life, he's not. You're in it like your parish priest and probably your bishop and or the dean of your deanery or something like that, who is making decisions day in and day out that it would actually affect something of you, the budget or what you're allowed to do or not allowed to do.
Yeah, I'm kind of pleasantly surprised that you went to the deanery as an example. I think a lot of Catholics don't even realize that they're a deanery. stories.
We got into we really did do that deep dive into the life of Pope Francis before he became Pope. And we touched a little bit into his conclave. I'm sure we'll get into a lot more about his conclave today, but where do you think we should start out today?
Yeah. So when looking at the papacy of Pope Francis, I thought it would be good to just kind of take sort of a high level overview and look at some of the different themes. There is obviously it's something that played out in time, but there's always a lot of moving parts to the papacy, right? I mean, the Catholic Church is an organization with, 1 billion members, and yeah, I mean, there's only, a few thousand, bishops and such in the world, but still, it's just like the numbers of it are astronomical once you get to the level of the papacy. I actually did not dig too far into the actual conclave that elected him, so we might cut out that part. But it was because we had left him sort of with the election. That second time that he had, kind of come close. And this time it just so happens that, apparently one of the speeches that he gave in the general congregations, those gatherings of cardinals before the conclave proper, including those, the cardinals who will not be participating in the conclave, right? Those over 80, who kind of are able to hang out and influence things. Well, different folks would give different speeches, and Cardinal Bergoglio, his appeal really resonated, which it's interesting. Like he talks about it in his autobiography, that Hope, which interestingly was published like earlier this year. So very timely, like, obviously it's as close to getting someone talking about, their complete life in an autobiography that you're going to see. Cause like he was talking about things, from just in the last few months, of his life, it would turn out. So really the only thing that's, too recent to be touched on in that, is his hospitalization in, February and March. But yes, so there was an immediate, and it is natural, right? People are going to notice when you have the white smoke, the balcony scene, right? Because we had left him, just kind of accepting the election. Then you go into it's called like the room of tears, where you basically sort of say goodbye to your old life. You literally take a new name, right? He took the name Francis, and more specifically, he took the name Francis I, which is the first time a pope's done that. Not taking the name Francis, but assigning the first as part of the regnal name, just sort of with the idea of like, look, I am just part of this larger thing. So it would be interesting to see, if we end up with a Francis II, kind of like the John Paul I, followed immediately by John Paul II type situation. And I've always thought that was interesting that the, sort of the John Paul II became the much greater of an impact between the two. But one of the first things that really caught attention was honestly like, he went, and I believe he, just paid his bus fare, right? He insisted. He had to make arrangements because he had already bought like his ticket back to Argentina. And he insisted on making a lot of those arrangements personally. And then he did not move out of the lodgings that he was staying in as a cardinal. He decided, the apostolic palace is not for me. I'm going to stay in the Casa Santa Marta, where the cardinals stay for conclave, which makes an interesting scenario in this current conclave, to flash forward to the end of his papacy. Well, I guess beyond the end of his papacy, the papal apartments, traditionally they would seal those off, and traditionally it would be the apostolic palace, but now it's, literally his apartments in the Casa Santa Marta. Like he just had, a room with sort of like a vestibule type area, which was one upgrade that he had kind of accepted. Like, I'm going to I guess I'm going to need a lobby. I guess that's fair. I've got, these foreign dignities. Like, if I'm going to keep like, kings and queens waiting because I'm, meeting with, whichever random, young functionary in the church, that I've just decided to just have a chat with, right? Just to sort of elevate the lowly and, humble the higher, sort of that Marian sort of ideology, because he was very much a fan of Our Lady. Not that he would intentionally embarrass anyone, but basically the idea of just upgrading from like, one apartment, moving, I think like 3 doors down, but still in the Casa Santa Marta, like the idea that he wasn't going to take on these more ornate trappings of the papacy, really resonated with folks. I think it was generally received very positively. I think, most listeners are still going to remember that as an early splash of Pope Francis. You could argue that there's sort of like, a cynicism to it. And Pope Francis did have his critics throughout his papacy. We'll get into that. But I do think like that initial first impression, he was very well received with the idea of this humility, I guess you would say.
Yeah, I think that, and for people who are maybe not familiar with the Casa Santa Marta, it's basically a hotel. Would you say that's my understanding of it?
Yeah.
Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month, but it makes a huge difference to making the History of the Papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/History of the Papacy and join today.
Yeah, it's a 3-story building that was actually purpose built to host the cardinals when they're in conclave. Like, there's currently a cap of 120 cardinals, which for participating in the conclave, which those of you, kind of in the know on this present conclave, we're actually beyond that in terms of cardinal electors. Like, Pope Francis did not follow that cap. Now, it's not a scandal. Neither did Pope Benedict or Pope St. John Paul II. They all went beyond that. This is just the first time that it's actually been a scenario where there are more than 120 cardinal electors at the Pope's death. So that, that will actually be participating, which is interesting here in the context of the Casa Santa Marta. And the reason I bring it up is there are not extra rooms in the Casa Santa Marta. It's not made to hold 133 cardinals, not to mention their staff, which is what's coming, which is what's in Rome now. So I actually haven't seen yet, and maybe the information is out there at this point, but I've kind of been running around a bit, as you might understand. But I would love to know what those accommodations are for the people that literally can't fit, because they did decide that they're going to officially sort of waive the cap, basically with the logic of, look, Pope Francis is the Pope. Essentially, he's not bound by these, apostolic constitutions that set the cap of the number of cardinals, right? He's not restrained by that. So he made these cardinals. So clearly part of being a cardinal is, if you're under that cap of the age of 80, then you can vote in a conclave. So they officially decided, yes, we're going to let these folks participate, but I don't know where they're going to put them for the actual conclave process. So, yeah, especially since the papal apartments, where Pope Francis lived, keep in mind that's in the Casa Santa Marta. So his room is certainly off limits because it's still sealed. Like, did you see the Conclave movie? And I'm only asking because it is reasonably accurate in its depiction of the way that the papal apartments are sealed off.
I never saw the movie, but I read the book that it was based on, and it really did paint a very vivid picture of what it was like.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
especially because these cardinals, a lot of these cardinals are not the type of people who would be, at least maybe it's been a long time since they've had to bunk up with somebody else or live in a slightly Spartan style. And going into conclave at the best of circumstances, they're going to have to Boy Scout it a lot more than they've ever done, maybe possibly in their lifetime.
I think that's true, but also Pope Francis did have sort of a favorite type for his cardinals. He would talk about wanting shepherds that smell like their sheep. So I think some of the more this, I don't mean this in the dismissive sense, but like the pompous in the sense of like liking that pomp and ceremony. Those cardinals that are fond of the regalia and such, they often came kind of under criticism. Pope Francis would talk about them putting on grandma's lace, which for a person that is generally seen, I think, by most folks as having, a very a gentle and humble spirit, he could be pretty harsh to his critics, admittedly. He had I guess it's sort of a dismissive side at times. So, and I don't know that that's necessarily the best trait in the world, but, I'm not saying he was perfect. So I just figured I'd call that out.
Yeah, it's definitely a part of his personality. Mm-hmm. So when we go back into the very beginning of his papacy, and I remember when he started coming out with some papal documents like, was Lumen Fidei the first one that came out? And that was very soon after he was coming out with some pretty controversial maybe, but some definitely impactful documents, like right off the bat.
Yes. So Lumen Fidei, one of the things about it is it was originally started by Pope Benedict before his resignation. So it's actually a collaborative work essentially across two pontificates, because Pope Benedict had started sort of like this, faith, hope, and love type series. And it seems like it's in continuity with that. But yeah, it was released as Feast of St. Peter and Paul, which was June 29th. And Pope Francis had just been, elected like 3 months before that. Considering the length of these encyclicals, that's a pretty quick time, especially since it's not like it was the only thing he was doing, right? Pope Francis, one of the things he got known for real quick was these plane interviews when he was coming back from his, apostolic journeys around the world. And so that's where you get this quip, because he would make himself available to the media, no holds barred for 12 hours. Here we go. You get, to interview the Pope. And so, he gets asked about, gay folks. And that's where the who am I to judge kind of started rocketing around the media, and just kind of setting that tone. And it's interesting to see sort of like the way Pope Francis, and I think it's fair to say you could tell he kind of liked to tweak people, and to sort of, I think sometimes there's a little bit of a, I don't know if a wink and a nod is the right term, but, there's an awareness of the fact that he's, going to cause some controversy with the statements that he makes. But, just the fuller quote of that is, if a person is gay and seeks God and has goodwill, who am I to judge? So that was, asking about the possibility of, I believe it was, homosexual priests, which is a bit of an active topic just for a variety of reasons, including, some people being concerned, like, okay, is that, sort of enable it? Pope Francis really capped off his first summer with some serious church reform, because he set up a council of cardinals, not to be confused with, the College of Cardinals. That's the general body of the cardinals as a whole. But the council of cardinals was, 7, or depending on how you count and depending on how they have it structured at a given time, 7, 8, or even 9 cardinals that kind of, meet more regularly than the general body of cardinals. And they're sort of designed to help advise the church. It was one of those, like, almost like a UN type situation where, he'd have cardinals basically clearly intending to get kind of one from every continent at least, and then, a couple bonus Europeans, because that's the nature of the church, right? Pope Francis isn't absolutely throwing everything out the window, despite, it's kind of the concerns of some of his critics, perhaps thinking that he's gone way too far, right? It can be quite the process to try and change things in the Catholic Church, right? The alarm bells go off and the panels start lighting up. But setting up that Council of Cardinals kind of helped him have some structure and some feedback, and it wasn't seen as being as autocratic, at least, by most folks. He still had and will continue to have, even after his death, his critics. But that helped him do a lot of reforming of the, the organizational apparatus of the church, right? That curia reform that was very much on the docket. That was something that was on the to-do list, kind of the mandate from the conclave that elected him, was that, we need to get the church in more fit shape, right? Not just kind of hoping that things work out. So very much an intentionality there.
Then he hits the scene pretty soon afterwards with his next encyclical, Laudato Si, which was another one that I at least in the cultural milieu, at least if you heard, and I would even say it seeped into the broader culture, that was a real barn burner as well.
Oh, yes. I think, and, you could correct me because, I very much have that inside view of Catholicism. So, sometimes it's hard for me to tell, what hits that broader culture. But yes, I think people are very much aware of Pope Francis's, environmentalism. And, it's Laudato Si, and it's, the idea of care for our common home. And actually the name of that encyclical, it isn't Latin, because it's actually quoting from Saint Francis, right? Who obviously, Pope Francis had a certain affinity for, right? And it's in that Saint Francis's, 13th century Umbrian dialect. So an interesting language choice for the title of an encyclical, but it's talking about just sort of praising the creator of the earth and looking to see, how we can care for this earth that was entrusted to us by God. So just that was another area where people are like, okay, yeah, I can get behind this. I see the utility of having, people even coming from fairly skeptical backgrounds who are like, I'm not so big on organized religion. Well, I can see the utility of having religion organized for this cause, that I care about. Right. And so he would get some criticism, for focusing, on such as it is sort of like, a worldly topic. But the church has long had an environmentalist, streak, such as it were. Like I said, you can have these statements about, caring for the environment that sound very much like Pope Francis, but then you realize it's Pope Benedict saying it. So it's not like Laudato Si came out of nowhere, even though I've heard people in reflecting on Pope Francis's legacy, you'd think that it did, but it wasn't Pope Francis that, for example, covered the Paul VI audience hall with solar panels, right? That was, Pope Benedict, who, we're told, must not have cared about that because, he's got this more conservative reputation. But I mean, globally, there's not necessarily a tie between a connection between, being conservative and being opposed to caring about the environment and, making sure that things are sustainable.
I mean, yeah, you can't deny that a key tenet to the Bible all the way back to Genesis is stewardship of creation. And that's essentially our job as humans, is to steward creation. And that's something that's going all the way back to the beginning. How that actually plays out is a different story. And I think that Francis, in a way, was trying to define that for the 21st century. So with Laudato Si, that was really a really groundbreaking encyclical. And then it's kind of a hiatus in 2020, and we won't get into the nuts and bolts of his next encyclical of Fratelli Tutti, but it's released. It was released on October 3rd, 2020, which is really in the heart of COVID, the COVID-19 pandemic, which, I mean, anybody who's listening to here, we all know how impactful that time period is. And you think about it, in the 13 years of Pope Francis's reign, nearly half of it was this COVID world that we're dealing in. And I think that that's something to always keep in mind. And that's, no matter what happens in the future, if somebody was impactful from 2020 onward, COVID is going to be a part of their biography.
Absolutely. And actually, he does talk about COVID in that encyclical. He's very open. He says, as I was writing this letter, the COVID-19 pandemic unexpectedly erupted, exposing our false securities. Aside from the different ways that various countries responded to this crisis, their inability to work together became quite evident. For all our hyperconnectivity, we witnessed a fragmentation that made it more difficult to resolve problems that affect us all. Anyone who thinks that the only lesson to be learned was the need to improve what we are already doing, or to refine existing systems and regulations is denying reality. And then he also, talked about just how the COVID experience, momentarily at least, revived the sense that we're all a global community. We're all in the same person. As one person's problems are the problems of all. Suddenly you care about what's going on, in Italy, and so forth, just to see those, how they're all getting through this same challenge that was kind of, approaching everyone, in some ways all at once, and in some ways, in just different waves. But there is very much we're all in this together, right? My wife and I still joke, so kind of morbidly about, now more than ever, every advertiser suddenly said, as they find a way to hawk their product via COVID uncertainty.
Exactly. Maybe I've read this differently, or I'm not reading it quite right, but I always felt like with the Pope, and everybody had strong opinions, no matter on what side of any issue, the 5D chess that anybody was on. I never felt that Pope Francis got into the nitty gritty or the trenches of COVID, where everybody was like, you got to do this, you got to do that. He wasn't like, oh, you've got to do X, Y, and Z. He wasn't trying to go up there like he was an epidemiologist. I never got the sense that he maybe had his perspective on things, but it was never super in the weeds like a lot of world leaders got and local leaders. I never got that sense. And I think that I got that sense as well with other world crises that came along a little later on, closer to the end of his papacy. I mean, we'll get to it, the Ukraine situation, where he didn't get into the real nitty gritty, but he had a certain he did have a certain stance, but it wasn't what you might expect were the different pigeonholes that people tried to put him into.
Yes, the papacy has a very long-standing tradition. And, I say this, but also keep in mind, this is the same overall papacy that brought you, the Crusades. So it's not like, they always have necessarily the most moral high ground. And, there are cases to be made in some areas in favor of even things like the Crusades. You can find a justification for anything, and you can find a reason to hate anything. But Pope Francis, when it comes to war, condemned the war more so than he condemned the actors, right? More so than he went for the temptation to pin blame specifically on one country or another. And, at times it was met sort of with groans and eye rolls, like, look, we can't, both sides, Russia versus Ukraine, like that was not a popular stance to not condemn, but to keep those channels as open as possible, right? Like there were various points where it was clear, how he leaned. For example, at one point, I know there was discussion of from some of his subordinates, about just war document, just war, authorization, basically, in terms of Ukrainian defenders, right? And so, there was, some areas where the papacy, did focus on certain aspects of that, but it was always done with some intentionality of not burning bridges, right? Like you could tell he was hoping to figure out a way to bring about peace. Like that was his main priority, even above the questions of territory, which, in the Ukrainian situation, territory is the question. And, folks are willing to die for their country. But at the end of the day, Pope Francis's main focus was, look, war itself is a tragedy and it brings about other tragedies from it. Like, he would wear it on his heart. Like when you hear him talk about war, he's made me much more of a pacifist. I think that's some of his legacy for me, personally. There's still, oppression in the world, stronger powers going after the weak. And that still needs resisted. But there is something to be said for, look, we're not going to win every war. And if we try, and focus exclusively on, winning the wars, we're going to lose something of ourselves. So, how much do we fight via traditional means versus how much do we decide I am going to find something beyond war to anchor and to grit and to move forward from. You can call me a winner, you can call me a loser. But at the end of the day, I know that there is something more important than the endless wars and the flags and the, just claims over different territories.
And you really can't forget that, as much as you can almost say that at this point that Pope Francis and the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew, were fairly much bros. Pope Francis did meet with the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, in Cuba in 2016, which was well after the Maidan and all that, the color revolution of 2014. So that a lot of people weren't quite paying attention as much to the war as when it really kicked off in 2022. But things were still going on in Ukraine at that time. And Francis was meeting with other parties like the Patriarch Kirill, who's taken a lot of hits in this war. And I think he may have, if I'm not mistaken, they may have had a meeting after that as well.
I think it was just the one, but in terms of face to face directly, Pope Francis and Kirill. But I do know that there has been, kind of continuing delegations, right? some of the cardinals, would make their way to Moscow at various points. And honestly, that was one of the times where there were plenty of times in Pope Francis's papacy where I was surprised. The fact that, sit down with the Russian Orthodox, as distinct from the, the Greek Orthodox, there's a lot more tensions there between that see and Rome. And the fact that happened was something that shocked me with Pope Francis's papacy. There were a lot of surprises, but that one was shocking. Obviously it did not end up bringing out, all sorts of world peace. But, it's sometimes hard to tell what the fruits of a particular meeting were or weren't, because, we see sort of the headlines, and, we can try and read between the lines, but it's often hard to tell. So I just for a general caveat on, looking at, Pope Francis's papacy, especially from, just like a couple weeks distance, speaking of being hard to tell to evaluate, but we can still look at these major touch points. So yeah, I think you've got a pretty good idea of guiding this conversation along. So I appreciate you.
And I think let's put a pin on those, because I think we could revisit those in a little bit later, of his relation with the Orthodox of churches and ecumenical relationships and war, because I think that's an area we can discuss a lot more. But I think let's focus a little bit more inward for a moment into the inner Catholic Church dialogue and some of the politics, because there was this issue, and it was pretty early on with the dubia. And I have to say, I remember hearing a lot about the dubia in 2016, and I found it fascinating because I followed a lot. I try and follow a little, dabble a little here, a little there. And I was following a lot of the trad Catholics. And that's a lot of the politics inside of the church. And they were making a lot of this dubia. And I can say that even to this day, I really don't fully understand the dubia. And maybe we can expound a little bit upon that, because that really was an interesting episode.
Yes. So the dubia of 2016 came out of a document that called Amoris Laetitia, which means the joy of love. And that is a particular type of document called a post-synodal apostolic exhortation. Now, just to break that down for you a little bit, post-synodal means, it's after one of these synod meetings. So there had been synods, which is, a meeting of bishops. I think you've come across that before on your show. But they were held in 2014, 2015 synods on the family. And so once you have these meetings of bishops, oftentimes the Pope will kind of put together like sort of like synthesis document or some sort of reflection or sort of marching orders, just kind of as a follow up to that. And so this was all about family life and Catholic teaching on marriage and just looking at different aspects there. Well, the hot button issue that they touched on, and by touched on, I mean, one footnote out of hundreds in this document, got substantial interest because it was talking about these situations where you have people in what the church, calls in their terminology, like irregular marriages. So think someone who was divorced, and then, got remarried. Well, the Catholic Church doesn't recognize divorce, right? You've got to have an annulment, which an annulment is just saying that the marriage that was annulled never actually happened. So it's kind of that technicality. It's you're not ending the divorce by legal means. But you're just saying that there never was anything in the first place, which can be tricky, if you've got a blended family, Brady Bunch type style. Okay, well, I guess, are these kids illegitimate? Is my family illegitimate? How am I supposed to approach this where you're basically saying that there's something fundamentally wrong with my family? And especially how do I approach communion, right? Because if you're saying that, my marriage is irregular. Basically, that's shorthand for, in the more traditional interpretations, I'm not going to receive communion. I'm not going to be able to receive communion as long as this is the case. And by, as long as this is the case, I mean, like, as long as I'm living with my wife who I have children with, right? Like that sort of case where, like, your marriage is recognized by the church. So you're kind of stuck. And, what are you supposed to do in that scenario? Well, Pope Francis wrote about in this footnote 351, which was really sort of the red hot nuclear blast center of the theology discussion here. This is about that case of, divorced and remarried folks. Like, how does the priest counsel? How does the priest walk with them, these couples in these situations? And so he says, quote, in certain cases, this can include the help of the sacraments. Hence, I want to remind priests that the confessional must not be a torture chamber, but rather an encounter with the Lord's mercy. I would also point out that the Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, but a powerful medicine and nourishment for the weak. And so there he is, Pope Francis talking about, like, how to help these couples. Well, one way to help them is by giving them access to the sacraments. And if you're talking about giving access to the sacraments to people who are, according to the church's, traditional interpretations on these marriage issues, like, divorce is a no-no in the Catholic Church. I mean, just ask Henry VIII. Suddenly you're saying they can receive communion. So, like, is this not, a major issue? Is this not something we need to address? So that's what these four cardinals were freaking out about, to, just put it in layman's terms, with the dubia, right? So a few months after this, Amoris Laetitia came out, they produced this letter, and dubia is basically like, doubts or uncertainties, right? And so the idea is you send in this. It's a specific type of letter that cardinals have historically used to get clarification from the Pope on theological matters. Now, the idea with the dubia document is it's kind of an internal thing, right? It's like, like an email that you send, but it's not meant for, outside consumption, right? It's supposed to be sort of like a top secret thing. Well, let's just say that this dubia did not stay behind closed doors. And it did not receive a response from Pope Francis, because basically, it was sort of worded like, so this document that you sent out really, really seems like you like heresy. Do you like heresy? Like, that was sort of like the way some of these questions were worded, or at least my sense of the way that Pope Francis perceived these questions, right? It's like, this is not something that I'm going to respond to, right? It's,
the old, when did you stop beating your wife?
I was just going to say that. Yes, it is very much the when did you stop beating your wife scenario. And so I will, just as a little spoiler, this is what's called the first dubia. So we will be back for more dubia in a few years of Pope Francis's papacy, but this was the first real organized opposition within kind of the cardinals against Pope Francis, with a conservative sort of reaction to him sort of pushing the theological envelope. Pope Francis, and delete this if it's a repeat, but I think this may have gotten cut a little bit with the last section. But bottom line, Pope Francis was a big fan of pushing the theological envelope, of making a mess. Like, he would actually encourage priests, like, he would explicitly say, go make a mess. Like, I don't want you to be afraid of these doctrinal lines, right? Don't treat it as an electric fence. Think of it as a fence that, someone's on the outside of it. Maybe you can help them come in so they don't get eaten by zombies. Like, you have a mission to go to the edges, to the margins of the world and even of theology, right? To catch those people who are on the outside looking in and try and get them drawn into the church. Because the church is for everyone. Like, that's very much Pope Francis's view is, I'm not worried about the theological niceties. I'm worried about reaching people.
And it always seemed like that idea of annulments and the way that worked, that it wasn't, it was weird. Let's just put it this way, that a couple could be married for 30 years and then they would find some sort of workaround to give them an annulment so that they could go marry again or be how they wanted to be. And I think that maybe in a way that Pope Francis was trying to regularize that by blowing it up in a way. And I think that kind of leans into what you're saying, is that he did try and make a mess of things in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's fair. Like, I'm not sure how much of this corresponds to exact reality, but my perception is, whether you can end up with an annulment kind of depends almost more on like, do you have a good lawyer, right? Like a good canon lawyer in this case, like, how much can we stretch this? Like, what sort of, no, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to talk about greasing palms, but we'll just, I'll just throw that phrase out there and like, just there's things that should not be handled differently from one application to the next. But I definitely get the sense that it can vary. And that is not a good thing. Just that inconsistency.
And we're living in an era where there's a lot of where not everybody's Catholic, and there's a lot of people, you marry a Catholic, you divorce a Catholic, maybe you weren't Catholic when you got married and then you became Catholic, and any other permutation, and the system's got to deal with that in a way.
It almost makes me think of like, I feel for like copyright clerks. Like there's just so many like new inventions. And at this point, I know AI is inventing stuff, I'm sure. And they've got to figure out, who gets, control of that. It's just like, it's a system where it's important and you need to figure it out. But to figure it out and to have this system continue functioning, you're going to need to get creative in ways that you never have, with how you actually keep the overall consistency, because procedurally, it can be overwhelmed and it gets just this unproductive granularity. And when you're just kind of keep trying like the square peg round hole, sort of thing. But at the same time, they can't just throw out the baby with the bathwater. So there's very much an overall conversation to be had with that as I start to suddenly switch into, political non-answer mode.
Then we kind of have two threads going on. One of the next big things, so you have Francis and the participation of women in the church, and that's one major issue, I guess you could say, that he works with. And then the other one is, so you've got the Synod of Synodality and a lot of issues with that. And then there's this other one, Traditiones Custodes, which, reversed. There was especially under Pope Benedict. I mean, I think we can deal with this one pretty quickly because we'll need to dive in a little bit more with the Synod on Synodality.
Yeah, the Synod on Synodality is still like going on and still having ripples. Basically, that's projected out another 5 years into the future at this point, at least. But
this one, and maybe it's a deep dive in its own right, but the Pope St. John Paul, he was starting to relax a little bit on the traditional Latin Mass. And it's more than just doing the Mass in Latin. There's a whole culture behind that. And then Pope Benedict he eases things a lot more, but then there's a big reversal under Pope Francis. And maybe we can just talk like very briefly about what is this culture? Again, it's not just, and we're doing it all in Latin. There's a whole culture.
It's not a translation change.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
It is a very different experience, the traditional Latin Mass. I think we might have brought this up in sort of like the first part of this. I'm talking about like Francis before he was Pope when he was Cardinal Bergoglio, because one of the interesting things, especially for folks who, sort of know what's coming during his papacy, which is obviously where it now is, back when he was a cardinal, Cardinal Bergoglio actually, went ahead and initiated some of the things that Pope Benedict was calling for with his Summorum Pontificum document, kind of expanding access to the Latin Mass. So, the future Pope Francis, then Cardinal Bergoglio, was like, okay, well, we're going to go ahead and have Latin Mass. Not everywhere, but, here, you're my Latin Mass, representative. So we can kind of, stay in line with what they're doing over in Rome, which I think that's interesting. And, it's something worth considering when you think about like these different, divisions and different, strata within the church, that, you have your average Catholic, like I talked about, I've been a fan of every Pope. It just kind of seems the thing to do. And it's not that I shut my brain off, but there are things that you can see within each papacy, hey, you know what? This is some good stuff here. And, I'm not going to completely ignore what I don't like, but this isn't a matter of politics, right? This is a matter of not just making it all about how you feel, but make it more about what you do. And what you do as a Catholic, there are worse things to focus on than, hey, how do I take this message that I'm receiving and do some good with it? And so, in Pope Francis's case, when he was Cardinal Bergoglio, some of what he decided to do with this message of, we're going to go ahead and bring back the Latin Mass, in a bigger way than it had been, was, okay, well, I could use this to appeal to more people and let them find something that works for them in the church. But it's then interesting when you fast forward to his papacy, right? And, after a few years of sort of settling in and, maybe some, really annoying some folks with some of his theological boundary pushing, he went ahead and reversed Pope Benedict's opening up of the traditional Latin Mass with this Traditionis Custodes order that basically is certain people can have Latin Mass, but for example, you can't even promote it in a bulletin now, which I don't know if people realize. I guess kind of it makes sense that the Catholic Church regulates bulletins, but it was surprising to me that they had that level of granular oversight. I was kind of surprised that there's even a formal process for what a church bulletin is as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, because oftentimes as much as they're used to think about it as a top-down thing, that's pretty granular level, right? It's what are these papers that we pick up at the back of the church, right? Just to show grandma
you're
that we
talking
went.
About that church bulletin. Oh, there's going to be a next Saturday pancake breakfast. There was that sort of editing of that. Wow.
Yeah. So you can't talk about oh, by the way, we've got a Latin Mass over here. No, you can't advertise there. It's that kind of granularity, which this goes back to that where I mentioned, Pope Francis can have a sort of harsh, could have sort of a almost harsh and almost vindictive side. He was not necessarily going to have a lot of patience for folks that were deciding to place themselves oh, I'm going to actively oppose you. Well, that doesn't tend to play well with any pope. I will say that. And it seems like this suppression of Latin Mass was in part, in my opinion, sort of a backlash to the pushback against Traditionis Custodes, to the pushback against Amoris Laetitia. Raymond Cardinal Burke, who was, one of the big proponents of the Dubia letter, was also a big Latin Mass proponent. And so sort of a, retaliation. Yeah, but it's it's weird because there's politics in the church, but it operates at different levels. And getting back to, one of the other angles that we were talking about, like, how do we make these decisions within the church, right? Is it just top down where, one pope says yes, Latin Mass, one pope says no Latin Mass, and you just kind of have a back and a forth until people forget what they were fighting over? Or, do we get other voices in from, maybe the lower levels kind of being able to have their say, or like, just like more cooperative listening. That's a lot of like this synod on synodality, right? Because it's not so much about like, we have these church councils, kind of distributing, theology down from above, but it's, let's all walk together, and kind of journey together as an overall church. And, so he started up this synod on synodality. He sort of announced it, right basically at COVID time. We talked about that a little bit, kind of that fundamental, rethinking. And I do think it's interesting to pay attention to some of the timeline of just, this is going to be a tangent, but I think you're okay with the nice, papal history and church history type tangents.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oftentimes I see, Vatican II as a reaction to World War II. Just seeing how that traditional way of doing things did not do anything to help in this case of the world sort of fracturing. And then, perhaps a little bit more on the nose, the way that there was that reversal or very fundamental re-emphasis, reorientation of the Catholic Church's views on the Jewish people, as a whole. So I do think there was that sort of reaction. And, I think it's probably overstating to say that the Synod on Synodality, was that sort of reaction to, some of these culture wars things or even to COVID. But I do think it seems like it is pushing back on a certain type of just like top-down approach that Pope Francis saw as something that he was specifically wanting to oppose with his papacy. And so you see things like the Synod on Synodality, which kind of, started as like this, little project, right? I guess it's still a big global project, but, not necessarily something that's going to be remembered in a few years, right? There's all sorts of synods that come and go in the Catholic Church. But the Synod on Synodality was definitely something that kind of kept getting more momentum and kind of kept building up. So just keep in mind that that's going on in the background as we go deeper into Francis's papacy. Another thing that sort of gradually gained steam was this participation of women, specifically like, in church governance. Right? One of the more influential roles in the church is having participation in the Synod of Bishops, right? And in 2019, Pope Francis started having women kind of as part of the Synod of Bishops, which really raised eyebrows because, Pope Francis kept getting people, asking about women deacons, and he would, set off a commission and they would, study the question, but you wouldn't really see anything come out of it, right? Multiple commissions, through the years. But gradually, as Pope Francis started, putting women in higher places in the church, by 2021, there were women voting in the dicastery for bishops. By 2022, I think there were 3 or maybe even 4 of them in that dicastery, which, a dicastery is just like a church like department, like you might have like the Department of Taxation or, Department of Education or whatever. Dicastery is for like the Vatican's version of that. And actually it's a term that came up during Pope Francis's papacy. They used to be called like congregations, mostly was the word. But because he reworked and tweaked some of the constitutions, that was one of the first projects of this Council of Cardinals, was sort of reworking the Vatican's bureaucracy. Well, one of the less exciting aspects of that was just kind of the rebranding of all of these departments and things like that to these dicasteries. Sorry for the tangent, but basically having women on the dicastery for bishops means you have women determining who bishops are going to be. So, it's certainly not the same as making women be bishops, but in a lot of ways it's just about as fundamentally important because it's giving them a real say and an actual vote in who the bishops are going to be. And you can see how, if you're influencing who the bishops are in the Catholic Church, how that makes you have sway in the Catholic Church in the years to come. One of the questions that's still outstanding, but I guess it's answered at this point. But the question is what will happen with it in the future potentially is, will we ever see like a woman cardinal? It's theologically possible. The Vatican has said as much. But Pope Francis, he didn't end up doing it. Was he leaning towards that? I mean, by the end of his life, he had put a woman basically as the prime minister of the Vatican, Sister Raffaella Petrini, was the president of the governorate of the Vatican City State. And you can double check me on that. And I probably got it wrong, but basically she was sort of the in charge of the state side of Vatican City. And that was a position that always historically was held by a cardinal. Whether he would have ended up elevating her is a different question because he didn't have any, he didn't create any new cardinals after he made that appointment for her, because that was just literally this year, back in January. So you've got these women in these positions of power within the church. And obviously that's ruffling some feathers. You've got the Latin Mass kind of being suppressed effectively. And, you could tell Pope Francis's goal was kind of like, well, let's just kind of have it fade away. Right. And that's going to be easier said than done. And I don't even know if that was necessarily the goal, but just these long-term projects, right? The Synod on Synodality kind of rolling, and the Synod on Synodality itself, I would argue, is part of Pope Francis's push, or was part of Pope Francis's push to help ease the way for the Catholic Church, specifically, the Western Church, working closely and walking more closely with orthodoxy, because synodality is a substantial part of how the church is structured in the East. They don't have this, top-down approach that you get with the papacy. It's the bishops, working together and voting together and, having these, ongoing synods and, councils. So how do we get the Catholic Church more used to doing that sort of thing? Well, let's do this Synod on Synodality, right? Let's survey all the local dioceses. Like I took part in the Synod on Synodality. My wife and I filled out a survey because our bishop said, hey, fill out this survey, right? And then the surveys went back, and it's just like, okay, what are they going to do with all of this information, right? You're asking people, like, basically it's a suggestion box for the church. There was some more structure to that, but a lot of times, you'd get these surveys and then they would make their way up to the national level. And, you'd have all of these talking points about everything from, what should the church do when it comes to engaging with the modern world, right? Like, do we let priests get married? What do we do about LGBT stuff? Like, what concerns do you have about what the church should be doing? And just sort of like, take it all and put it into the suggestion box and then shake it around and see what comes out. By 2023, when the Synod on Synodality was really coming to a global level, because it would go, this process of kind of, working up these talking points and trying to figure out how to basically get the listening period transferred on up the chain to, all of these bishops talking through these issues as a global church. And not just bishops, because one of the changes that was alarming, especially on the conservative side, was that Pope Francis added non-bishops to the synod. And, you'd have folks say like, well, it's not a synod includes people who aren't bishops, like a synod is a meeting of bishops. Well, in the end, the Pope is an absolute monarch. There's not like constitutional prohibitions on what he can and can't do. And so, he decided to name a number of lay people, including lay women, to be voting members of the Synod on Synodality. So he had actually 70, a lot of them were deacons, priests, consecrated men and women. But a lot of them were just laity, able to participate and vote at the assembly. Like, their votes would weigh as much as a bishop. So that was certainly eyebrow raising. And that kind of got the temperature kicked up enough that we have a dubia around tubia, as it were, with a couple of cardinals who had signed the original dubia, 7 years ago at this point, Cardinal Burke and Cardinal Brandmüller of Germany, which is a little bit interesting because Brandmüller is certainly on the older end, and but Burke is maybe like 70. So he's definitely, as he runs around with some of the more traditional older cardinals, right? Like the JP2. Sorry. I think your audience can figure out what JP2 means. I'm not sure if you've used that acronym, but the JP2 and the Benedict appointees. But he's still going to be with us for a while. Like he's going to be in the conclave, for example, whereas these other dubia signers at this point, I don't actually. Robert Serra is going to be there as well. He's 79 at this point, so he just squeaked in. But basically, the second dubia letter, there was some back and forth between the Vatican and, well, basically between Pope Francis and this group of cardinals. The sort of back and forth that I think most people in diplomatic and government circles would describe it as unbecoming, I think, might be the term for it, because basically the cardinals said, the Pope answered the dubia this time, right? He answered these questions of hey, doesn't having non-bishops make this not theologically work? What's the deal? Are we getting rid of all church teaching on, homosexuality? And it's hey, please remember that the format of this document, the traditional structure of a dubia, is that it's answered with a yes or no, just to kind of give clarity, right? So you can't, the idea is you can't write paragraphs in response. Well, Pope Francis wrote paragraphs in response, and the dubia letter sending cardinals were not particularly big fans of that. They were okay, but the format here is yes or no, so please limit your answers to yes or no. And at that point, Pope Francis didn't respond because he had already given, several paragraphs worth of responses to that. And so the cardinals then came back and were oh, we sent Pope Francis this dubia and he didn't give us answers. And so then the Vatican comes back and is oh, well, no, we gave you answers. In fact, here, we'll go ahead and, make this public. Here's the answer. Here's the questions that you asked. Here's the answers that we gave. And I don't know why you put this dirty laundry out there. So that was, I guess you could call it a bit of a scandal. It was certainly popcorn worthy reading for Vaticanologists, right? People on the outside looking in. And honestly, I think the people on the inside also was pretty interesting to see that. So
I think that a lot of this, the Synod of Synodality, it really reflects the tension that goes all the way back to Vatican I, where Vatican I really sets out this monarchical and everything is revolved around the papacy. Vatican II is not necessarily a correction of that, but it's a correction in a way that it's trying to deal with that there was such a enormous change with Vatican I. And Vatican II takes that further in some ways, but also tries to introduce a little bit more bottom up influence in the papacy. And then it seems like the Synod of Synodality is trying to flesh that out even more so. But I think that in a way, like when you have that power that the Pope has, he's still the monarch, like you said, and it's hard to give that up, because I think it's the church, the Catholic Church seems to be in a way, is it going to, can it have its cake and eat it too, with being synodal, but also having an absolute monarch? Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Oh yeah. And like some of the ways that this plays out, like, I mean, you know, one of the vexed questions, right, with the Synod on synodality was the question of like, okay, like, you know, what do we do with these like questions of like how we approach, you know, same-sex couples, right? Like, hey, a lot of the suggestion box feedbacks we got said things about how we should make the church more welcoming for gay folks. Like, you know, how do we do that, you know, without compromising theology? Or like, you know, are we going to be revisiting our theology? Like, there's a cardinal that is called for the church to fundamentally like reconsider and, you know, kind of bottom up reworking of the church's teaching on homosexuality, which, you know, I'm pretty open to a lot of things. But when you talk bottom up reworking of theology, like that to me is eyebrow raising as a Catholic, just because I'm very used to, you know, the theology is set and you can kind of approach it with a different lens. Right. But it's kind of crazy, honestly, to see like, you know, someone who's that high up in the church calling explicitly for changing in theology. Like the idea is supposed to be that the theology is set, but you kind of build around it. Like, you know, figure out new ways while keeping the bones. But yeah, so lots of discussions there. But what happened was, and this is where it goes back into that, like, you know, bottom up versus top down, you know, papal monarchy question. Pope Francis, as the Synod on Synodality was kind of, you know, ramping up and meeting, like, you know, they were ready to have these sit down discussions with all of the delegates, including like, you know, the lay people and the women that have been given equal standing with these bishops in these meetings. Pope Francis said, oh, by the way, don't worry about the topic of blessings for gay couples. Basically, like, you know, we're already dealing with that separately. So like he'd had to took that rug out from under that, which was especially interesting because like he had just signed off on a document, saying flat out that you couldn't have formal blessings for gay couples because, and you know, this is to my recollection, a quote from that document specifically, God can't bless sin. Which is, you know, more of a conservative take than people would typically expect from, you know, Mr. Who am I to judge Pope Francis? But, you know, you could look up that document. But the reason I'm not focusing so much on that as the finishing point is because what happened shortly after the Synod, and, you know, keep in mind, this is like 6 months from that document. Basically, you have Pope Francis almost completely role reversing because, you know, while he's saying you can't have these formal blessings, he suddenly brings out this document called Fiducia Supplicans, which is a bombshell. What it is it's saying that the church can bless same-sex individuals even when they come up and ask for the church's blessing, like as a group. Like you're not supposed to give them the whole 9 yards, right, and figure out exactly what the intention is here, as long as it's an informal blessing, because you know they had already ruled out formal blessings, but as long as it's an informal blessing, you know, it's fine, you can do it. Which there was a lot of response to that, as you might imagine, from a variety of angles. Like, okay, what exactly does this mean? What is going on here? Is this a change in doctrine? Is this not a change in doctrine? If it is, or if it isn't, like, you know, what does that mean? You know, hey, Pope Francis, could you speak a little plainer, right? Give us the old dubio response of yes or no instead of a few paragraphs, right? But this is the Pope who, like I said before, he likes to challenge people. He likes to make a mess. He likes to make people force them to where they're going to have to get uncomfortable in some fashion with things. And we'll touch back on that here in a bit when we talk about the cardinals again in the upcoming conclave, because he did set kind of a surprise for them that wasn't really a surprise. But to finish the fiducia supplicans topic, one of the cardinals that Pope Francis had just created a few months before was Cardinal Mbongo Basungu. He's an African cardinal. And actually, I'm going to look up which specific country real quick. He's a Congolese cardinal. And what happened is Africa is on the more conservative end of the theology, and I think it's just generally fairly conservative in a number of areas overall globally. But yes, in the context of Catholicism, their theology is conservative. Gosh, who would have seen that coming? But when it came to fiducia supplicans, basically the entire bishops' conference of Africa and Madagascar got together and said, okay, the Pope has come out with this document and we're not going to do it. And with that church history knowledge, how well is that going to be received in the Vatican, right? How well does the Pope take this pretty much rejection of the direction that he's giving for the church, right? That, how well is any absolute monarch going to take that? The answer is he allows it. They get Pope Francis's blessing to ignore Pope Francis's direction when it comes to implementing fiducia supplicans in Africa. And just the way that this exemption for the entire continent of Africa from this papal document was worked out without, causing contention and without, getting into a big fight and a big dust up. That's one of the reasons why you'll see Cardinal Mbongo Basungu as a serious contender in the upcoming conclave, because that took some diplomatic chops for sure.
And you think about it, if an absolute monarch is going to give in on something, either an absolute monarch, they have the choice of crushing it or giving in. But if they give in, they're going to look weak. And again, that starts asking the questions of which direction is Francis going in. It was really hard to tell. I like that idea that he really was a disruptor in so many ways.
Yes. Yeah. He knew how to ruffle feathers. And I will say, I think, if we're talking phases of Pope Francis's papacy, I think it's absolutely fair to take a look at COVID and say there's a solid dividing line, right? Because it was in a lot of ways. But I think one thing that really you saw more envelope pushing from Pope Francis after the death of Pope Benedict XVI, since keep in mind his predecessor had been hanging around for the first, 10 years of his papacy. He just passed away a couple of years ago, right on the very last day of 2022. And it's after that period that you get fiducia supplicans. It's after that period that you really get a lot of the more forceful aspects of, I think it's fair to say, pushing this synod on synodality and this more synodal approach to Catholicism, which is interesting to see, the conservative reaction to that, kind of trying to push the Pope into, governing via fiat and not consulting the cardinals. And like that pushback by definition is coming from the cardinals because the Pope is the one wanting to have a more synodal mode. So it's just sort of this like interesting, like backwards discussion. I just thought that the way that played out has been fascinating. But in the end, no one has infinite energy. And Pope Francis, it certainly seemed like, he would start to have more hospital stays, right? Kind of get more free. I mean, at this point, he's getting into his late 80s in sort of our little narrative for today. But he made a point of having a giant apostolic journey, right? A big international trip just a couple of months after, having a longer hospital stay. And, at this point, he's consistently in a wheelchair. But then he goes off on this, 12-day trip through Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and Singapore. Just, sort of island hopping in his own way. And, at the same time, he's going off and creating another batch of new cardinals. I think he's got the College of Cardinals at his historic maximum, which I'm just going to leave at that. But I'll also say, I think he got 140 was the top, and I'll let you know if you need to cut that part. But yeah, so he's basically, essentially packing the College of Cardinals, but it's not like scandal because the Pope's the one who's there to choose the College of Cardinals, right? So I actually talked earlier about the amount of space that you could physically hold cardinals, right? In that Casa Santa Marta, going back to the beginning, right? With him not wanting to leave those lodgings, right? You almost get the sense of like, he didn't want to give up what had gotten him to what seemed to be for him a pretty comfortable place spiritually, right? I think he felt like he would lose himself in the apostolic palace amid that finery. And, if that's the case, well, I do think he stayed grounded in his own way, with some faults and foibles. I don't think he's above criticism. But he knew who he was, and he knew what he wanted to do. And, whether you agreed or disagreed, he was going to do it. But his last way of making a mess, right? And his last way of kind of being a bomb thrower, basically. And his last way of trolling. Sorry, these are it is what it is. But the fact that he made it so that there were more than the canonical limit of a number of cardinals is that he forced the cardinals who have this apostolic constitution, right, that they're supposed to follow during the Sede Vacante. Pope Francis, basically, as soon as it dipped below, or as soon as it looked like it was going to dip below that canonical maximum, he would treat the maximum as a minimum. And he would, appoint new cardinals even before it went below, right? It seemed to me like he wanted to be sure that there were more cardinals than there were technically allowed, just because he wanted that messiness. He wanted them to not be able to follow the rules, as explicitly as they might like, right? For the, particularly rule following faction of we're going to follow the rules regardless of, whether it makes us a big, small church or a small church, or, it's fine. We're not caring about the church size. We're caring about, making sure the rules are respected. Well, that's one perspective, but I honestly think that Pope Francis was so opposed to that kind of strict rule following that he decided to make it impossible for the cardinals to have a conclave that followed everything to the letter, because he set them up with, look, these are the people I've made cardinals, and this is the maximum number of cardinals you're allowed to have, and there is an irreconcilable tension to this. So have fun with that. I think that was intentional, fully. And, I think that's almost as good a note as I need to end on. But I do want to just note that another thing that was going on in the background, and they had a date set up for this. May 20th was supposed to be, and may still be, it's hard to tell. It'd be pretty quick turnaround at this point. But May 20th was supposed to be a meeting with Pope Francis and Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, right? East and West. At least the largest, or at least the most influential chunk of Orthodoxy and Catholicism getting together in honor of the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. They were going to meet in Turkey. Well, when they had originally announced these plans, they actually announced it right towards the beginning of Pope Francis's papacy 12 years ago. And they said that they're kind of making it as a commitment for themselves or for their successors. Well, Patriarch Bartholomew is still with us. And Pope Francis, well, it'll be up to his successor, whether he's going to, follow through with that commitment. And, if he does, everything looked like it was pointing towards a unified date for Easter, with East and West, which that would be fascinating from a church history perspective. That's definitely been one of the more vexed issues in church history. So we'll see what happens there. But like both Bartholomew and Francis were talking about wanting to resolve this calendar difference, right, between the Julian and the Gregorian calendars, at least as far as dating Easter goes. So
it will be really interesting to see, because that is such you wouldn't think it's that big of a deal, but the calendar issue inside of Orthodoxy is such a hot topic. Mm-hmm. And it's just gotten to the point where some of the churches have at least understood where they were coming from, what they call it, the revised Julian calendar, yes. Which, and that's sort of settled down a little bit after, I think it's 100 years or something like that. And I think to spark up a new Julian calendar, yep. Given everything that's going on, I think that that level of disruption, and I wonder if that's maybe what Bartholomew is going for, to just see what happens, like when he granted autocephaly to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Yeah. That was a major boundary pushing and
boundary breaking. I mean, the Russian Orthodox are no longer in communion, right, with the Greek Orthodox. Yeah. Which, kind of frees them up, I guess, to talk to Rome more. Yeah. And I think that in a way that again, you look at the complicated chess maneuvers, and maybe there was something to that, to give them some latitude, to give the ecumenical patriarch more latitude to talk to Rome. And it's a fascinating issue. And I think that the next pope, it will really tell where he comes in on that issue, because I think if you look at the laundry list of things that we've discussed in the last 2 episodes, it's several hours, that I think that ecumenical relationship, and we haven't even touched on what Francis was talking about with Protestant churches. That is probably one of the top tier issues of what the next pope is going to be facing. What does he do internally? And I think that theme of the monarchical pope versus the synodal, kind of the overhead of a big synod of ideas, and these ecumenical relationships is going to be that's what the next pope's going to have to deal with. I think in a way, and it's a lot more important, those two issues, than I think things like with gay marriage and the gay blessings and the issue, the inclusion of women in certain things. I think those are much longer term issues that in a lot of ways will follow the culture and the church
church will be directing the culture in a way, but I think it's got to find its way. But these things are core issues of how this church is going to be structured. Is it going to be a synodal, or is it still going to be completely Vatican I monarchical? And then how does it relate with these other Christian churches that are in a lot of ways growing, some are not growing? What's going to happen with Christianity in Europe? Like, these are the I think the more immediate issues.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And just for the record, the 140 number is correct for the high number of cardinals, so you can keep that in.
Awesome.
Imagine if they picked a non-cardinal. It's possible. Any baptized, any unmarried Catholic male is eligible. So my son was a bit shocked when he learned that he could be elected Pope. I'm like, look, they probably won't pick you, but it's okay. If they do, I would actually encourage you to say no. But if you decide that that's what God's calling you to, I'll support you, my son, the Pope. Just know, if they're picking a literal child, it's because they don't want someone who knows everything. Right.
Yeah, I think this was a great conversation. I'm looking forward to more, and definitely everyone keep tuned into Pontifex, to Popular History, to the history of the papacy.
Yes, Steve, thank you for that. Before we well and truly wrap up, I do think I'd like to offer a bit of an addendum, because in retrospect, while trying to make sure I talked about the big impact headlines and controversies of Pope Francis's papacy, I didn't really discuss the aspects that he would have considered the most important, and which Francis watchers will recognize. He may have been a lion at times when running the church and interacting with world leaders, but he was an absolute lamb when it came to the average oppressed and downtrodden individual. He had a real pastoral heart, and that, more than any changes he made or tried to make, is what endeared him to many. And it's what he would have wanted his legacy to be, from his first official papal trip to the island of Lampedusa to memorialize too many migrants and refugees lost at sea, to the poor and needy of Rome, prisoners, migrants, homeless, and transgender people, who greeted his casket when it arrived at his final resting place in St. Mary Major.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for having me on, Stephen.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And we will talk to everybody soon.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.